about a month since I watched Nosferatu, and I cannot stop thinking about it. This is Mr. Kitty, by the way. He will probably take off in right now. Ow, 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 ow. Yeah. So you might hear him yowling in the background, but I was obsessed with Nosferatu. If you clicked on this video, I'm assuming that you are too. Obsessed, disturbed, in love, appalled. I think it brings up a lot of different thoughts and feelings. And one of my favorite ways, as we know, is exploring my thoughts and feelings through books. So the recommendations that I have for you today are just a collection of books that I think touch on similar tropes, motifs, vibes, or issues that kind of came up in my mind as I was watching the film. Yeah, I'm gonna get right into them. I hope that you enjoy and you hear about something that is new or interesting to you. I'll be starting with the books that are most closely related to Nosferatu, and then as I kind of go on by the end of this video, it's gonna be like really loosely connected to it in my like weird brain way, but I will try to offer a reasonable justification. Okay, cool. Let's go. The very first one is very obvious. It's Dracula. Nosferatu in 1922, I believe, was an unauthorized adaptation of the Dracula book. So we're primarily following, at least in the very beginning of the novel, Jonathan as he goes to do some business with a guy in Far East Europe and is kept there while Dracula feeds on him. So definitely there are very strong resemblances throughout the story. It's just with the women and like what goes on back home and how it ends, which is quite different. If you haven't read Dracula and you're wanting some like evil vampire vibes, that's where you should start. My next suggestion is Carmilla. I know I have talked about this quite a lot on my channel, especially recently, but Carmilla is Dracula's predecessor, and it's about lesbian vampires, or lesbian vampire singular. In this one, we are following the perspective of a young woman who is living in Austria. She's very lonely, she's very young, and she lives in this kind of fancy old manor house. Her dad is some kind of duke or something like that. And she's supposed to have a female friend come and visit, but that female friend dies mysteriously. And then this other mysterious young woman comes and joins their household and starts to prey on our main girl. Okay, so this is Evil Lady Vampire. I think that this book kind of plays with the relationship between eroticism and the predatory nature of the vampire in a really similar way to Nosferatu, but the focus is the relationship between these two women, Carmilla and her host. And my favorite fun fact about this that I share, I think probably every time I talk about this book, is that this was published in 1840 something. Obviously, being gay or queer or lesbian was totally illegal and completely socially unacceptable at the time. But the way that they managed to get around this for publishing the novel was just the argument that once you're a vampire, you're not human anymore, so it doesn't count. And I think that's just kind of funny and awesome. The next book that I want to suggest is one that just kind of comes to my mind partly off of vibes, but also partly because of Nosferatu or Count Orlok's obsession with Ellen and the sort of love triangle that I think the director and a lot of the cast have kind of described between Ellen Thomas and Count Orlok. And the book that reminds me of is Phantom of the Opera. I need to be totally honest with you guys. I haven't read this in years, but I did read the book and I do remember enjoying it almost as much as I enjoyed Russell Brand in a face mask. Not Russell Brand. What is that man's name? Russell Brand would be a completely different kind of phantom. So this book is about, again, a young woman, this time named Christine. She is the daughter of a famous Swedish musician who works and lives in Paris. He dies, and when he dies, he promises her that an angel of music will come and guide her. And so eventually this opera house that she spends time in, like she starts hearing a voice inside of it, and it begins to teach her how to sing. And it's sort of this beautiful relationship between the two of them when she doesn't even know like who it is, if it's like God or like a real angel. Very similar to Ellen's angel of comfort kind of thing. But then things begin to kind of terribly go wrong and change once Christine's childhood friend comes along and is looking pretty cute, which brings out the sort of murderous, jealous, obsessive angel of music. So this is like gothic at its best. I think there's actually very strong similarities between Ellen and Christine in terms of being torn between these two entities or men or whatever. One of them being kind of monstrous, a tragic, lonely figure. So much of this story kind of revolves around the experience of loneliness. I will also just like briefly acknowledge it's probably not great representation for disability or people who have like scarring or disfigurement or anything on the face, because there is like a really strong relationship between being like physically disfigured and being like evil in this book. But it's from the turn of the century. If you can kind of look beyond that, you'll enjoy the story, then Phantom of the Opera. The next one that I want to suggest to you is another one I have talked about ad nauseum because it is one of my favorite books ever. That is The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. This is a collection of dark, very like adult-leaning, adult-oriented fairy tales. It is the same gothic vein as Nosferatu, Phantom of the Opera, etc. We're exploring like all different kinds of fairy tales. There's retellings of Little Red Riding Hood, Puss in Boots, Beauty and the Beast, multiples of Beauty and the Beast. Bluebeard, The Bloody Chamber is sort of retelling of Bluebeard. Each one is so great. First of all, because the prose and the way that they are told is just like lush. It is an experience reading them. But also because of how Angela Carter subverts the damsel in distress trope, or explores female desire and sexual awakening through subverting classic fairy tales. Deals a lot with like power dynamics, all of that stuff. So you can go in wanting to chew on some of these topics, but you can also just go in and like have a really good time with some awesome fairy tale retellings, mashups, whatever. The thing that possibly lingered with me the most as a person who's like relatively artsy, into art motifs, and spends a lot of time thinking about like obscure stuff. Editing stuff here, I should have explained a little bit more that these Death in the Maiden motif is usually a like skeletal person or like a dark demonic type of figure juxtaposed with like a young virginal kind of looking maiden. It plays with a lot of different ideas depending on how the artist is using it. Sometimes it's a bit of a memento mori and reminding us that death is like a victor in all things, that he always wins, everything dies, even a beautiful woman. Sometimes there are threads of eroticism brought into it, as in Nosferatu, where you're talking about like loss of innocence and decay. There's all kinds of stuff like that going on in this. So that's kind of what I'm referencing. The Death in the Maiden motif, especially towards the end of Nosferatu, I won't spoil it, don't worry. It was so loud, and it was so, if I say beautiful, do you know what I mean? Like, not beautiful as in great and something that I want to happen to me, but like striking, maybe is the word. But the Death in the Maiden motif is very common to German painting in particular. And when I was thinking about this, there is one specific book that is a YA fantasy, sort of a romance, that immediately came to mind. That is Belladonna. And in Belladonna, Death is a literal character. He has been with her since she was a child. He has been kind of a plague to her since she was a child, because Signa, our main girl's parents, guardians, everybody around her eventually seems to meet an untimely death. And at the start of this novel, we see her moving into a sort of creepy family mansion that belongs to her last living relatives, and while she's there, she meets the ghost of her mother, who kind of implies or leads her to believe that she was actually intentionally murdered. And so Signa tries to figure out who did it with the assistance of the personification of death, who is sexy. And I just remembered who I was thinking of like almost this entire time. I don't even remember if it's accurate to the descriptions in the book. Whenever the death character would come on the page, I was just imagining a slightly more somber version of Lucifer. And if you've read this book, I would like to know, were you also imagining Lucifer? Kind of along a similar related tangent, I want to recommend Fruit of the Dead. This is a Persephone and Demeter retelling. I say that very deliberately, Persephone and Demeter, not Persephone and Hades, because it is not a romance. It's much more of a Jeffrey Epstein situation. So we are veering back to Hades, or the personification of death, or this you know, evil predatory guy being a predator. And we're following a young adult, young woman who's working at a camp for kids. One of the parents comes along, offers her a job to come into his private island where he has tons of staff and to be essentially a one-on-one nanny for his child. She goes, she's not allowed to take her phone, and like immediately begins to be kind of cut off from a lot of people in her life, including her mother. Her mother flips out and goes to try and find and save her daughter. There were parts of this book that were a little bit hard to read, although I will say it is not as dark as it could be. This is also a debut. It is literary leaning, like maybe a very slow-paced kind of thriller feeling, but there's no magic or anything like that going on in it. Nothing supernatural, but lots of references to the original Greek myth. Like I think the girl's name is like Cora or Corey? Might be Corey. So that is Fruit of the Dead. The next book I actually have physically. My books are mostly in storage right now, so I don't have a lot of them, and I try and read digitally as much as I can anyway, because I don't have a lot of space. But Comfort Me with Apples. I'm going to tell you pretty much nothing about this book because it is crazy short. It's like 100 pages, I think. I read it at my library. I loved it so much that I bought the physical copy because I loved it so much. It is more in the same vein as probably Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber. It's feminist. It's a subversion of a few different stories that are kind of laced together, and I feel like this would probably apply to anybody who enjoys the Stepford Wives or maybe Annie Bot as well. So Comfort Me with Apples. I have one more, which I actually think is the farthest reach, but I don't want to end on it because it's such a far reach. This is a paranormal romance. It's also the 10th or 11th book in a series. So I'm throwing you into the deep end, and I don't necessarily know if I would recommend that you pick up this book to start with, although I think you could, but it would lose a lot of depth because this book is Lothair, and as I said, it is deep into the Immortals After Dark series. And the thing about Lothair is that he has been the villain for like 10 books, and then he finally gets his romance, because each book in this series follows a different couple. This crazy, honestly psychotic dude, and he is a vampire who has lived for a very long time. As I said, he's crazy, like truly on the edge of sanity, because he has drunk so many people's blood and memories. It's just driven him loopy. And so he captures his fated mate, who is a human woman, because he can't bear to lose her, but he doesn't really, I don't know if he even really wants her in the beginning either. But other people are after her to hurt him. And so Ellie, his mate, is kind of caught in this lurch between power and fear, and she's quite clever and sassy and like can actually meet him point for point, which makes this quite fun because she doesn't let him get away with anything. And yeah, they fall in love. He literally is willing to rip his beating heart out of his chest for her, as all men should. And it is obsessive, questionable morality. Well, there. And then a 180, I'm gonna bring us straight back to medical misogyny. I talked about this really recently. It's one of the books I am dying to read this year, and I'm not quite finished with it, but I think you might enjoy it. If you were curious about Ellen's like diagnosis and like the doctors not really taking her seriously, this is Unwell Women. It is a nonfiction book about the history of medical misogyny, how women's health has historically been controlled, misunderstood, and exploited. It deals with all kinds of things like medical gaslighting, pain diagnosis or not, wandering wombs, periods, suffrage and suppression, birth control, public health, private pain, autoimmune diseases. Everything seems to be covered in this. As I said, I have started to read it. I haven't quite hit the part with the pictures in the middle yet though. So, and I feel like it's a really pertinent topic right now. So those are all the books that I could think of that I have read, that I have really enjoyed, that I would recommend to you to pick up and give a shot if you enjoyed Nosferatu and want to read something that has a parallel vibe or energy to it. I hope you heard about something that was interesting to you. If you have any suggestions, this is the whole reason I've actually made the video right here. If you have any suggestions, I want to hear about them in the comments, because I've been in a reading slump. Like, the movie put me in a reading slump, I'm pretty sure, because I can't stop thinking about it. It's obsession, that's what it is. If you made it to this point in the video, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again very soon in another one. Take care wherever you are. Bye-bye.